Good to go. I've got to say, those were terrific presentations. Thank you so much. We're going to use this panel opportunity to see where the commonality and the conflict is. We've gotten several questions from the crowd, which I will introduce. What you've been hearing is a demographic, an economic, and a business perspective of how organizations are coping. We're seeing a very interesting marriage of intangible assets, resilience, capabilities, cultural capital, to coin a phrase, and I'd like to facilitate a conversation around this. And I'd like to begin with a question to Joe on this, and that is, no doubt you've been talking to and listening to economists and, of course, a variety of business leaders and organizations. I would like to ask you, what's the biggest argument you're having with them about the demographic impact and the change in which demographies, which generational groups will come out of this more resilient, better off than others? What's the most interesting conversation or most interesting argument that you'd like to share here? You don't have to name names, but that wouldn't hurt either.
So, and I'm gonna tease Jonathan. Generally speaking, I try not to speak to economists. They depress me, so I try to stay outside of that air, if you will.
No, very wise, Joe. Very wise.
Unfortunately, when we are stressed, we know from psychology, we turn inward. And pundits, politicians, and indeed even theoreticians in economics are no different. They latch onto the dominant story that they had even before the pandemic and hold on to it tightly. And sadly, that story is the following. The pandemic has not only set everyone behind, but this aging of society worldwide, no matter what country you're looking at, is not the greatest success of humankind. It's the greatest problem. And the reason that is a problem from their point of view is they're looking at it through the lens of yesterday's definition of old age. They're assuming that a good chunk of the population cannot continue to work or wants to work. They're assuming that no technology will come out to improve healthcare or chronic conditions. So they're grasping on to a story written, frankly, in the 1800s that has really gotten baked into public policy and economic models in the 1960s. So even with a pandemic, it's gotten even tighter.
So I'm going to have to ask you to participate in this, Aireen, because Malaysia does not have the same kind of aging population concerns. But here you are, you're doing something which is very bold, very brave, and literally transformative. You're reskilling people. Was the theme of your talk. Generationally, forgive me for sounding too Western, but from your part of the world, how is the generational issue viewed that you've just heard here? Because clearly the aging population is a dominant thesis in OECD countries. How do you deal with that with your SMEs, with your customers, with your workforce?
Yes. So the median age of Southeast Asia is probably about 29 years old or so. Yes. In Malaysia or Singapore, it's slightly older than the rest of the region. I mean, it's about probably in the 30s, mid-30s. The reskilling part, even I think it's easier with the younger generation. It's okay with people in the 30s or the 40s and so forth. We do find that the small medium enterprises, the older ones, are a bit reluctant to change. They kind of like felt that the e-commerce was just something that they can do in the meantime during the lockdown, but after that, then maybe they could survive with what they used to. Whereas the younger generations were more than happy to learn new things. They want to learn how to build more traffic into their homepage. How can they use IoT to detect people and guide them into their shop in the future and so forth? They want to learn more about digital marketing. So digital marketing is actually a very popular course among the small, medium enterprises and so forth. Even the farmers, and I was mentioning about the farmers and how we want to try and match them with the merchants. The older generation are probably not too keen to be on our platform. They're more than happy to work with the with other what you call this middle agents, because yes, the middle agents provide them with loans, provide them with many other credit facilities and so forth. Whereas the younger farmers are more inclined to try technology. If they would look at how can AirAsia help them provide to upskill them in terms of understanding tech, is there a way to look at data to help them to increase their crops and value of it and so forth? So it's a different way of looking at it. So the younger generations are more open. The older generation, which is generally their fathers in their late 50s or early 60s and so forth, are a little bit reluctant to change. Yeah.
Yeah, Michael, if I could, I just want to add a little spin on the demography curve. We tend to think that aging is an industrialized world problem. In fact, Malaysia will have a greater proportion of people over age 60 in 15 years than the United States has now. Malaysia and the developing world in general have a problem. Will they get rich before they get old?
That's the classic China thing. I want to come back to that, but do want to ask Jonathan a question, because even though he's on, quote unquote, the wrong side of the demographic divide, he is very data oriented, et cetera. So the question I want to ask you, you've heard this remarkable, I would say, intangible asset narrative from AirAsia Digital, where data and human capital / retraining are key. Is that the model for recovery going forward for legacy organizations, or do you believe that's really a function more of culture, regional things, et cetera? How do your data suggest how organizations, global organizations and national economies do this kind of transformation?
No, it's a fascinating question, Michael, and I'm sure, like everybody on the call, I'm full of admiration for Aireen and her organization and what she's done. Now, what's tricky about this is that, of course, many organizations find it very, very difficult to do the kind of pivot that Aireen has talked about. And one organization, which certainly I spend a bit of time talking to, are banks, commercial banks. And again, be interested, there are probably people on the call who'd work in this area. And maybe it's a contrast with what Aireen is talking about. But if you talk to a lot of commercial banks about using data as an asset and all the terrific examples we heard about, what they'll tell you is they'll just tell you operationally it's incredibly hard. We've got an enormous number of legacy systems. When we first started, we were on system X, now we're on system Y, then we're on system Z. None of these systems talk to each other. And so mixing up of all these different kind of vintages of data appears to be astonishingly difficult for at least some of those companies. So that's a story that I must say I hear quite a lot, and it sounds like airlines and possibly retailers have been much more agile in the way they pivot around all of that. Now, then we're into all the details about the extent to which, for example, one is using open source and all that kind of thing as well. But there do seem to be strong differences between different types of organizations, Michael. Yeah.
Yes. Can I push back at you on this? Because you presented in your charts very well. The classic notion of R&D, training, et cetera. And clearly, I didn't hear Aireen mention R&D at all, but she absolutely talked about reskilling, retraining. She talked about things that accountants do and do not have confidence around. Let me ask $1 trillion, €1 trillion, £1 trillion question. What do you see as an economist, somebody who's involved in statistics and econometrics and data? What do you see about in the next 3 to 5 years about how government institutions and indeed how private enterprise values data as an asset on the balance sheet in the capital structure statement? Using Aireen and Google as an example of these things, do you think we're going to see part of your capitalism without capital transformation be explicitly acknowledging the value of data going forward?
I think, honestly, Michael, there is going to be just a growing wedge between what we measure and what we think, are assets on the balance sheet and what accountants and national accountants are prepared to measure, and what firms, again, like Aireen was talking about, what firms are actually doing. And if all of that, those types of intangible transformations are going to become more important after the pandemic for all the reasons, that I tried to argue, then I think we are going to see a bigger and bigger wedge between the performance of actual organizations and what the accounts and possibly even what GDP and other types of more aggregate forms of economic measurement are going to tell you.
Joe, I don't disagree, and I want to use that to go to Joe on this. Do you believe or do you observe generational perspectives on the value of data? And I want to draw a distinction between data and digital, because as a digital experience, yes, I can order an Uber, yes, I can order delivery, yes, I can shop, et cetera, and it's a user experience. But the fuel, the whole cliche about data is the oil of the post-industrial economy. Are there generational differences that in fact make a quality of life difference in terms of the way certain assets are perceived and valued?
I think that you do see, and go back to Aireen's observation about younger and older, I think you do see an older population, painfully for me defined as 50 and older, where they will see data as a little less tangible of an asset that they prize themselves in. However, the one thing that I'm going to kind of side with my older colleagues, if you will, on the following. Data certainly is driving business, but it is driving businesses that are commoditized businesses. We are seeing that personal remains the premium. So whether or not you can make a transaction and have engagement, we should never mistake efficiencies for engagement. And so what we're about to see is a new inequity, if you will, in service. For those folks that have the income, they're going to still have a person on that Zoom, on that call, and in their office or in their home. For those where they're just looking for efficiency, I just want something delivered, it's going to be all about the data. However, even with that high touch experience, it's going to be data to inform how does this person wish to be touched? What medium do I engage them with? So yes, there is a divide, but please, I really don't want the world to believe that everything's going to be digital. Yeah, of course it's going to be digital. It's the new water. But remember, the high touch is still the thing that makes the consumer feel special.
Aireen, do you agree with that? You know, you're talking to a guy who wrote a book on recommendation engines. So I'm sort of biased in that I believe that you can actually create engagement, not just efficiencies with data. Aireen, I would imagine that a low-cost airline, you know, let's put the crazy guy who runs Ryanair, you know, to the side, that a low-cost airline cares a lot about user experience. And you talked about that. So let me ask you, do you believe that data is going to be used primarily for efficiencies, or is it also going to be used for value-added engagement? What's your experience?
For me, it's we use data in 3 different ways. One is for revenue enhancement and looking at new business areas, the conversion rate, the personalization, and so forth. How can we optimize the pricing, for instance, or optimize the needs and the wants, or create something that people don't even realize that they want, but we understand their behavior. They don't realize it, but we see that their behavior, they want this, and then we alert them, and then they say, yeah, okay, they want it really. So to the point that we're currently creating a customer intelligence platform so that it can cut across the whole group that we're creating under AirAsia Digital, so that it becomes easier with single sign-on, and we identify that person when they go into AirAsia.com, and then we know what they're going to do when they with the payment that they transact with using Big Pay or loyalty points and so forth, basically. Then the second aspect, like I mentioned, is how do we use that for operational efficiency. This is more how we use data in the airline operations. Because as a low-cost carrier, we need to ensure that our cost is always low so that we can always provide or sell affordable fares to everybody, to the masses. So it's really...
And turn those planes around in under 25 minutes.
Yes, and there's 10 stakeholders that's managing that 25 minutes turnaround, right? So it's not just one operations control team doing it. It's the pilots, the cabin crew, the engineers, the ground staff, the operations control, the security staff. They all play a role in making sure that efficiency stays. And And there's a lot of things happen when you're running an operations. There's always issues, there's always problems, and you need to make quick decision in terms of what you need to do to reduce aircraft ground time, to reduce delays and so forth. So how do we make use of all this data, real-time data that we can get, so we can make real-time decision? So if there is an aircraft that's grounded in Maldives, for instance, and we don't have an engineering team there to fix the aircraft, we usually have to wait for the next flight to come in with the engineers, and hopefully they bring the right tools to fix the aircraft. Right. So we don't need to do that these days, right? So we kind of like can predict what's going to happen. We can mitigate those issues where the engineering team is even creating a blockchain of spare parts across the group. Wow. So creating a marketplace of spare parts. So there's less inventory required, and you know, we can actually utilize those inventories rather than they're being put in a warehouse and not being used, and that's very expensive for us.
What's the third one?
The third one is providing a seamless journey, the seamless experience to our consumers, and also a seamless experience to our workforce, so that they enjoy the work. And how do we make use of voice or face or ambient intelligence or whatever that we're working on in data, so that they don't spend unnecessary time doing things that can be done through maybe machine learning or through normal, simple algorithm and so forth, so they can work better and be more productive. And the same thing with the consumers. How do we make it a seamless experience for them, so that we give them things that they know when they want it, how they want it. Yeah.
So this is excellent. So I have to go to Jonathan here, and now I'm going to ask you an unfair question, Jonathan. This is one of those BBC kind of unfair questions. I won't say that's redundant or not, but here you are, you're listening to this very interesting real world ontological discussion of data. Do you really believe that Treasury and healthcare, NHS, do you really believe that government agencies are going to have the right kind of data to do meaningful policy when you listen to this level of detail? And we can scale this across all manner of industries, because they have really taken data as an asset seriously. I'll go further. AirAsia Digital takes data as an asset more seriously than Treasury and the Bank of England does as an asset. What do you think?
Two thoughts on that. The first thing is, I think what many policymakers would say, and I'm going to put my economics hat firmly on. Sorry about this, Joe, but I'm just going to be a mournful economist for a moment. What all the stories you've heard from Aireen to an economist reveal the kind of magic of competition. Right. The reason why firms, have managed to turn their planes around in 25 minutes, when previously, probably only a few years ago, somebody would have told you it was absolutely impossible, is because of the competitive imperative to do so. We had a case study of that in the UK, where the major London airports used to be owned in common by one operator. Essentially, there was no competition. And if you said to them, let's take Aireen's exact example, I want my plane turned around in 25 minutes, they would say to you, absolutely impossible. Once that competition was restored by the breakup of that ownership, 25 minutes became absolutely possible. So I think the first thing for policymakers is to make sure that there's a competitive environment, and then the kinds of stories that we've heard will come up. That's one thing. Michael, I'll say one more thing very quickly, since you mentioned health. We are in the UK sitting on an absolute treasure trove of health data, and it's called the National Health Service. Right. And the possibilities for researchers to be able to discover, incredible things about all the dimensions of our health experience, old people, young people, whatever it might be, through that data are enormous because of the particular way that we have. What is difficult, however, are the privacy type of issues around there. So in Aireen's case, sorry to keep coming back to you, Aireen, but I give my data to you voluntarily because I like flying AirAsia and all that kind of thing, and I don't mind what you do with it. In health, of course, it's much more difficult to accept some tricky privacy issues. So Michael, in answer to your question, if I'm sitting in the Bank of England, the Health Service, the Treasury and all of that, I've got to be very mindful of those kinds of issues. navigating my way through that. But it is a potential treasure trove, which could revolutionize, a lot of treatment, the experience of old people that Joe was talking about as well, and profoundly change our lives, actually.
Joe, I'd like to ask you to comment on this, because obviously AgeLab draws upon data. You're concerned, of course, you have many researches and publications on the ethics of privacy in healthcare going forward, remote monitoring of health, et cetera. I just want to ask, yes, there's a demographic distinction in how people see data as an asset, but do you see imperatives of healthcare, people living longer, healthier lives? Do you think this is going to change cultural norms around privacy, around data sharing, around anticipatory interventions, as opposed to you only get treated when you get sick? How do people talk about the way data and analytics are shaping their aging lives as opposed to their life at work?
It is interesting. We see an incredible paradox both in the UK, US, and a few European countries that we've looked at. And the paradox is this, that younger consumers are more paranoid about their data than older consumers. And what's paradoxical is these are the same folks that will sleep on a stranger's couch or get into a stranger's car. So it's a little strange from that point of view. But across the board, one of the things I would argue is that data or privacy, personal information, is the new currency. That people are willing to tell you anything about their health, their wealth, whatever it might be, if they can clearly see a transparent reason as to what they get in return. So to give an example, in the older population, look, there are smart toilets out there that will, shall we say, download from the user what you had for breakfast, did you take your medication, and everything else. And that's terribly invasive in many ways, but you'd be amazed the number of older people in Japan, United States, and the UK that are willing to give those data if it says, look, you want to know what I did in the bathroom today? Great. That's my way of not going into a nursing home. So it's a transactional relationship. It's when the data's out there and I don't clearly see where I'm getting out of it, that's where there's a real issue. American Express probably knows more about me than my wife of 35 years, but that convenience makes it worth it.
I will not talk about your ongoing relationship with American Express, but ask Aireen this question, which is, as data has become more important to the enterprise, how much time do you spend and your colleagues spend being concerned about these ethical issues, these regulatory issues, disclosure issues? Has your success, has this transformation invited certain compliance and ethical issues that you really hadn't anticipated?
Yes, for sure. I mean, there are new areas where we need to make sure that we're in compliance with all the regulatory requirements in data, especially when we have our fintech business. So that fintech business is actually being over, how do you call it? Is the central bank that's looking at it and overseeing it. And we need to make sure that it's in compliance with all the central bank's requirement. So whatever that data that our fintech company BigPay has, we have to be, they can't really share it with others. There's only a few things that they are able to share, and we need to get consumers approval for many things and so forth for else. But on the other hand, they are able to get more data coming from the other companies in order to be able to provide the kind of.
But what if you found out? Here you are, you run this organization, you've been doing these things. Are the lawyers, are the regulatory people grabbing you by the lapels or grabbing you by the elbow and saying, Aireen, you really need to realize that if we continue this, we're going to have to disclose differently. We're going to have a different terms of relationship with our customers, terms of carriage. We expose ourselves. We can't go global because it violates GDPR if we do this with the European. I'm just sort of curious, what's popping up there? Because really identify this is key.
Yes. So we have our own data security and data governance team. So that's where the information and cybersecurity team actually handles. So they work closely with the data team and the risk management team. So yes, they actually ensure that we're always in compliance. They work with the lawyers, and we have a data officer as well in the company. But these are new things for us.
Right.
As you rightly say so, right? So we just actually formed that last year, and it's something that we're still continuing building, and we actually make sure that we have our legal team that work closely with us and the data team as they build things to be, to ensure that things are in compliance and so forth. Yeah, with the various regulatory. So far, we haven't had any issues. Just the central bank, we have to be very mindful because of the fintech business that we have. Yeah.
Very good. Let me ask one last follow-up before going to Jonathan and Joseph on this. When you look 12 to 18 months out, and the recovery, when we don't know how the pandemic will play out, it's a great unknown. It's to use a University of Chicago phrase, Knightian uncertainty rather than risk on this. We just don't know. How agile do you feel your commitment to cloud and data has made you to cope with the unexpected? Have you shifted from planning to agility in terms of your organizational and cultural expectations?
I think our culture has always been more agile than planning. We do have our own 3 years plan, but it never seemed to stick. It always evolves every few months. So I think we've got very accustomed to that. So when it comes to the pandemic, we were quick to change. What we did was the first 2 weeks was to review all the costs that we have to face and how do we fix that? How do we renegotiate certain costs and so forth? And then once that's done, once that painful exercise is done, how do we make use of what we have right now and quickly build from there? So it's part of the culture already, and it's a very flat culture, and it doesn't have any unions as well. So I think we're able to move fast.
Just in the interest of time, I'm going to go to Jonathan and then to Joe, the last word. Jonathan, you're listening to this. I think you have almost a caricature of a case study in how to leverage and scale intangible assets. How do you think that's going to inform, given your talk, how do you think that's going to inform risk and uncertainty management in the UK and in Europe in the next 12 to 18 months?
I liked, Aireen, your thing about nobody seems to stick to the plan. Wasn't it the boxer Mike Tyson who says everybody's got a plan until they get punched in the mouth? So the answer, I think, is that the policy authorities, be they in the UK, be they in the US, be they in Malaysia, need to make sure that policy doesn't mistakenly punch, businesses and firms and consumers in the mouth, which is providing some certainty, providing some, the background to have some long-term planning, and trying to give businesses the chance to navigate their way through all of this.
Quick follow-up on that. Based on what you've heard, and I don't want to sound, Sargenty rational expectations or Lucasian rational expectations thing, but what's the most important thing you think authorities need to do in terms of expectations management, given the uncertainty on one hand, and B, the knowledge that data and intangible assets undeniably matter more going forward?
I think it's very much around, to give a very short answer, it's very much around this Knightian uncertainty, that the thing which is going to really be difficult for businesses, especially investing in intangible assets, which are irreversible, difficult to get the money back, is if they see a lot of uncertainty, if they're waiting for news to come down the track, then they're going to not invest because they're going to keep waiting. And if there's one thing that the policy authorities can do, it's to try to smooth out that path and stick to, a certain plan, so that, as I say, businesses can do that planning without that getting in the way.
Terrific. Joe, I'd like to give you the last word, but I'd like you to give the last word in the form of advice to leaders. You ended your talk with what leaders need to do in terms of compassion and clarity and directive. You've been listening to uncertainty on one side, the importance of data and analytics on the other. We may disagree about efficiency versus engagement, but based on what you've been hearing, what advice do you give for legacy leaderships, legacy institutions on doing more than muddling through the next 6 to 18 months?
So in addition to the caring, coping, in command, to show that they're empathetic, they know what's going on, and educating their employees and their clients, and sticking to a plan until they get punched in the face, or as Eisenhower said, you plan and you plan, and then when you go to war, you throw the plan away. The thing that keeps me up at night is something I'd like to have the leaders out there in business and government and generally society pay attention to. This discussion, we're talking about intangible assets, upskilling, agility. This is traditionally focused on institutions and organizations. COVID-19 has put in fine relief now a new responsibility that no one told us as individuals we may be responsible for, that we need to reskill, that we need to understand our personal intangible assets, that we need to be flexible and agile in the workplace, because our institutions, particularly during the pandemic, have been somewhat flexible, but really putting more and more burden on the individual. We have not socialized that to our children in education. We have not told our employees that. So we need to start building the stories and the institutional pathways to make an agile workforce and a resilient consumer.
Terrific. I want to thank you all individually, collectively, collaboratively. Very informative, very insightful. We're all grateful for your time. Lord knows I am. Thank you.
Thanks, Mike.
And many thanks, Michael, Jonathan, Joe, and Aireen, for such an interesting and inspiring discussion. We'd also like to thank the audience for joining us today and for their thoughtful questions. Please join us next week, Thursday, 8th of October, when we will look into technological solutions that will support recovery and growth. We will share the videos with you from today, and we will be looking for your feedback to improve our events. If you want to know more on how to collaborate with MIT and Imperial College London, please follow the links on the chat. Thank you so much once again.